this is exciting for all of us. Sujith and I started this journey probably about 14 months ago or so, of just, man, this would be really interesting to look at this concept of introducing and accelerating the maturation of individuals that have decided to move into the community setting. And there's such a belief on our co-chairs of the viability and the importance of that setting, that understanding how we can play a role into the future and having a legacy value to an initiative that is just not tonight. Believe me, I mean, we have committed a long-term approach to what Cofai is. And what you'll see tonight is a snapshot of it, but it's the start. It's definitely the marathon concept versus the race. So we're going to kick it off right now. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. Brian, I'm going to keep going. Next slide, if you're cool with that. So next slide. So I'm the tee up for this because it's a new concept, quite frankly. I don't think anybody has really looked and directed the amount of activity and effort into this sector like this collective group has. And we believe in it so much. And there's a rhyme and reason, and there's also a mission associated with this. And literally, we have built this thoughtful and disciplined approach. And this is all around the concept of the next leaders, right? The next leaders of community oncology, and how do we assist in that process in the most authentic way? And I think many of you, through interviews that we've done leading into this, there's many gaps that exist from that transition from, let's call it, an academic or institutional setting into what I think you're obviously seeing is the dynamic nature of community oncology. It's not one size fits all. It's not one element. It's the diversity of it. It's the dynamic nature of it. It's the challenges that come a part of it as well. And I think, and I don't want to be too dramatic, but the viability of the future of community oncology is at stake. We are all believers in this site of care. I believe it is one of the most powerful site of cares in treating cancer patients. I think the activity and the ability for these groups that are represented here to perform is exponentially as great, if not better, than any other line or site of care out there. But I think there is a challenge when you look at the numbers, that the future from a supply and demand side does not look promising from a standpoint of the amount of cancer patients that should be treated in the community sector and the amount of clinicians that'll be viable for it. So our ability to be a part of what this can do, not from 2 months, not 2 years, but 20, 40 years, I think is really our bedrock behind what energizes for us. And when we look at this dedicated activity, so this activity is going to follow a disciplined approach, and we'll take you through it. And it's important for us to set the table that way, because this program is for the participants at the end of the day. I mean, we're giving up our time, not giving it up, but we're giving our time, our effort to ensure that this is done the right way, that there's no misaligned incentives, there's no bias, there's nothing that gyrates the program other than the authenticity of creating a lane specifically on clinical immersion in the community oncology, and then also personal financial wellness as well. Next slide. So those are the 2 lanes for Cofai. We split them up. We were originally going to do a long session on a Saturday. I think there's obviously challenges with doing weekend programs. We felt like this was best served to introduce Cofai and do it as a 2-step approach, which tonight, the immersion in the community oncology, and then on Thursday, the financial wellness component. Next slide. And you've seen this through the invitation process. There's a lot of elements. Boy, there's a lot to this. So it's not only these elements, and it's not limited to that, but there are many things that we're going to take you through, both on the indoctrination and community oncology, but also the personal wellness program as well. And our goal tonight is to give an introduction and to get your feedback, either verbally through conversation. So there's no mute button tonight whatsoever, or through surveys or audience response, because that's where the customization begins. Next slide. And I wanted to introduce, before we go any further, the co-chairs have been not only fantastic to work with, capable, credible. I think they believe in this mission, but I've said this before, if you surround yourself with good people, good things will happen. And these are great people. And I just enjoy their company and enjoy the stimulated conversation and just their innate ability to deliver something of value, and the desire to deliver something of value. It just has created this just dynamic amongst the co-chairs that I believe you'll see and it translates into a conversation and an effort and value that hopefully you're able to achieve not only today, but throughout the life of Cofai. So I'll turn it over to the co-chairs just to introduce yourself. And if you want to just give a top line of what was your experience going into the community? And then number two is, why are you a part of this? Why do you want to be a part of this? So Sujith, you and I have been on the forefront of this for, like I said, about 14 months. And I know that this has been, a mission for you from your days at the Cleveland Clinic. So why don't you kick us off?
All right, there we go. So Sujith Kamadi from Ironwood Cancer Center. I'm a general medical oncologist and also the chief medical officer of a group. We have about 42 medical oncologists, about 11 radiation oncologists, about 12 urologic oncologists, about 9 breast surgeons, and a couple of gynecologic oncologists. So I help to manage the practice and also have a fairly busy practice. Although some claims I do not work enough, so I'll have to figure that out. So prior to coming here, I did my residency and fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. Then I decided to stay on as faculty in GI and thoracic oncology. Did that for a couple of years. Then my career led me over to Houston, where I was faculty at Baylor, also with Texas Oncology and Baylor, combined practice for about a year, and then finally landed up in Phoenix, Arizona. We started off a group when I joined, that was about 14 years ago, of about 8 medical oncologists. So we've grown over the last 14 years through internal growth as well as mergers with our other practice to this large organization. We have about 1,000 employees and such, about 75 oncology-related physicians. So over the process, I've grown and learned things in medical oncology, things in the administration. It's been very fruitful, not knowing anything, to the point where I'm today. I transitioned from an academic lifestyle, being in an academic practice for about 3 years prior to joining community practice, and I had to learn things as I went along.
Thanks, Sujith. Josh?
Good evening. Joshua Cox. I'm the Director of Pharmacy and Research at Dayton Physicians Network in Dayton, Ohio. We are a fairly large practice. We have about 38 physicians in the medical oncology, radiation oncology, and urology spaces, about 450 employees, 6 locations, an accredited specialty pharmacy at our central location. And Joel, I think, you kind of led into, what I kind of think my goal or a goal for the program really is, and is that I don't think it's exaggerating to say that the future of community oncology is at stake, right? I mean, we need strong leaders who understand the business of oncology. I've been with Dayton Physicians for almost 13 years now, came from a hospital setting prior to that, and I knew exactly nothing about the business of oncology when I started. So the learning curve was steep, and it's been an enormous benefit to have that understanding. And I wish that I had the opportunity to have some mentors, and I have had some mentors, but maybe a more formal mentorship in the beginning, because ultimately I hope that this program will equip the participants to be the leaders in community oncology moving forward. So with the ultimate goal of making sure that this model is viable, so that patients across the country can have access to what you referred to as one of the strongest sites of care, right? But it's the that side of care that provides the highest quality and highest value and the easiest access. So I think it's important that we're doing this program in order to ensure that our future is strong.
That's great, Josh. Thank you. Annette?
Yeah, I'm Annette Fontaine, and I am from Albuquerque, New Mexico, part of New Mexico Cancer Center. And like my colleagues or practice have branched out from medical and radiation oncology into a multi-specialty group. We have urologists, pulmonary, primary care, ENT, and growing. And of course, the reason for that is for survival, of community oncology. And I was fortunate, I trained in Morgantown, West Virginia, where community oncologists were actually associate professors at the university. So, as a senior resident and fellow, we would get to assist them when they were going on meetings, round on their patients. So, I was introduced to community oncology early and joined my group right out of fellowship. But like Josh was saying, you join a community oncology group and you know nothing about business, and I always wanted to learn the business of medicine. So I did an MBA, but it's an MBA. It doesn't really prepare you for what's happening right in your practice. It's really getting involved in the administration of the practice and understanding the day-to-day runnings that really helps you. So, when I was invited to participate in this, I was excited because I felt that there was a deficiency when I joined the group, and I really had to push myself forward, and invite myself into the administrative team and let them, I'm interested in this, I want to know about this, I want to learn. And I'm hoping that we can excite all of you to take that initiative in your groups and become the next leaders.
And that's great. Thank you for being a part of this. Bimal?
Hi, my name is Bimal Patel. I'm a medical oncologist. Also, just like everybody on the panel, Sujit, Annette, part of a large group that's historically has roots in medical oncology, but has evolved as the landscape in the sense of consolidation has evolved. So from being a pure medical oncology practice over the years, we became a medical oncology, radiation oncology, and then with surgical oncological arms like breast surgery, etc. So we are in San Francisco East Bay. We've been around for 40 plus years. I've been in the practice or with the practice for 30 years. There are about 54 physicians, about 10 advanced practitioners, and about 400 employees. So 350, 375, something like that. So it'll be great for me to bring to Cofai life experiences of somebody who, just like all of you, after training, we start our professional journey, and Sujit kind of gave a bit of what his journey was like, and some of us, like Annette and I, both went straight from fellowships into a private practice or a clinical setting, and then things evolve and we learn, and it'll be great to impart, so to speak, such insights and experience for the benefit of others in forums like this that Cofai is sponsoring. So good to be here.
Thank you, Bimal. Can we go to the next slide? And these four are leaders in the community. So, they get 50 requests a day. So for them to be a part of this, I'm just overjoyed with it. But also they bring just differential backgrounds that I think is going to round out this program. And it's just a view into it, because we're talking about the diversity of community oncology. It's not one lane. I mean, there's so many elements and sub-elements to it. And to have this level of expertise, I think is just, it's going to make the program, quite frankly. And I think it's going to provide that long-term value that we've all talked about. That other lane we talked about, which is the personal financial wellness, we have agreements with national organizations like Morgan Stanley, Cohen and Company, and McCarthy Levitt, that they are there to be content experts. There's no other purpose with that, and you'll see that on Thursday night. But I want to thank the co-chairs again. I think that's a very well-rounded group, and our conversation to this point, as far as rounding out this program, has been extremely provocative. It's been very complimentary, and it's been for the sole purpose of creating that bridge across the gaps that we identified. So next slide. So then the other element is who's Cornerstone. So some of you might know us, some of you don't. Just to give a quick snippet on us, which is we focus in on the community. I've 27 years in the specialty therapeutics, most of it in oncology and almost all of it in oncology, into the independent community oncology practices. And our goal is to maximize the quality care, patient care. And we do it through network aggregation. So if we're not finding value-added opportunities to create a sustainability in the community, we're not doing our job. And it is that partnership that is critical to what we do. Next slide. And it's why is Cornerstone right to run this program? We hear all community oncology all the time. So our view is, as I alluded to, this site of care is so critical to optimizing patient care for these cancer patients, that the independent model, to me, from my view, is such a critical element to it. And it's under fire right now. There are challenges. So if we can play a role in that paradigm, we're doing our job. So if you look at this as an element to sustain community oncology for the future, it fits well with us. The second area is, we are managed by business-minded folks. So we have full-time employees that really look at how we can create value in the marketplace. So looking at these areas, more so probably on the business side than the clinical immersion. These are the experts, being the 4 co-chairs. But our sole focus is to create these value-based opportunities. So we'll learn things through Cofai, but we'll put them to work for you as community oncologists to create a level of sustainability amongst your practice that has that legacy value, hopefully for you as you become a leader within your practice, and you can take it to the next, handoff that's, generational within your practice. So, and it's led us down the right path. We're not a Trojan horse model. There are very limited things that we do that is based off of, an expectation from our practices and our clinicians. It is based off of creating value and having a level of participation. It's culminated in this network is the largest independent community oncology network in the US. And that's since the inception about 5 years ago. Next slide. So when we start looking at what's the approach and what's the right approach, as we alluded to, we're business minded, but also we're very disciplined and classical the way that we put a curriculum structure together. And we look at this as an adult learning approach. And the 2 pillars of an adult learning is the intrinsic motivation and the problem center, right? So the intrinsic motivation is, I want to get better. I want to create value for my practice. I want to understand all these elements. I want to become a leader. And then on the other side is I want to do things right for my family from a personal wellness perspective. I want the ability to make sure that all the hard work I put in creates an opportunity or multiple opportunities for my family. And then it's problem solvers. Okay, what are those gaps? What are those areas that we can really dig into? So that's the bedrock of adult learning. So if you look to the right, what we're leveraging is what they call a channel filter approach, which is those 2 worlds being immersion in the clinical community oncology and personal financial wellness. Those are so broad. So if we wanted to take a deep dive into all those elements, we're here for a week, and Bimmel's not spending his entire vacation on this Zoom. So we had to look at this as a channel filter, which is a general introduction. So what are all those relevant areas for tonight being immersion in the community oncology, and then for Thursday, the personal financial wellness, and introduce those, right? So it's a preview, it's an introduction. So you're not going to get the punchline. You're not going to get the secret sauce. It is literally an understanding of, here are the elements that are very pivotal to increasing the overall productivity of a clinician as well as an oncology practice for tonight. And we're going to ask you questions. So we're going to do it, audible related. So questions out to the group, ARS, audience response, and a survey. And you're going to tell us, what are your gaps? And gaps are okay. It's a self-awareness exercise, which is, where do you want to improve? And then also, what are the relevant areas of focus? So we take that information, and then the next phase is to drill down on those areas. So channel filter it into the areas that are most relevant. They're going to provide you the greatest amount of value. And then we bring in the content experts. Then we have the individuals that are the co-chairs here to go deep on things such as OIG affairs and the finances of a practice, to clinical trials and things like that, that it will be an extensive tutorial. So case studies, individual engagement and application. So I bring that up, and I'm very intentional on that, is that this is a marathon approach that we're taking here, but it's very methodical and it's very disciplined in adapting this adult learning approach to the curriculum structure that we've put forward. Next slide. So this just depicts it even more. So if you look at it, it's a partnership and customization. The more you tell us, the more you guide us, the better we're going to do. So tonight is the buckets and elements. So the 4 main elements you're going to see tonight is a SIT analysis of healthcare from a macro micro, community oncology landscape, the infusion dispensing pharmacy strategy, and then the strategy of community oncology. That's the start. So that's the right. That's the marathon start. Then it's customization. We start lifting up. So it's a needs assessment, market research, personal content build out. And then we go into a content deep dive where we're hitting the mark on the areas that are going to serve you the best and allow you to create the greatest amount of value for you personally as well as you professionally. Next slide. and not to be trite, we can call it Cofai University or whatever. We're allowed to have a little bit of fun with this, but we definitely want this to be a partnership over the long term. So stick with us. I mean, the incentive, as I alluded to, there's no Trojan horse to this. Your growth and maturation is our incentive. It's a bridge to where this specialty and where this site of care can go into the future. So we are in this to customize it, to be as intentional as possible, but that's going to start through an interactive exchange between us and you. What we're trying to do tonight is create a stimulus to create that exchange. Next slide. So the agenda, and this should put a smile on Sujit's face because I am right on target, my man. I'm right on. So I can't be blamed if this encroaches the outer realm of the time frame associated with this. So, and Sujit will laugh because he tends to tell me that it takes me an hour to make minute rice. But besides that, we got through the first section here, and then I think if you look at the bottom part, what's critically important is this is the first time it's being done. So we're in uncharted territory here, but we have spent a tremendous amount of time and we've put a lot of effort into a disciplined approach that we think is the best step forward. But you're going to tell us one way or the other. You're going to tell us, we can pivot here, or we can adapt or adopt some things that are recommendations for you. So that's where the give and take and the two-way partnership takes place. So we've gone through the welcome introductions, the overview, the Cofai overview, the agenda overview, and then we're going to start dipping into the healthcare situation analysis, the community oncology landscape, the infusion dispensing pharmacy strategy, the strategy of community oncology. I only highlight that for the fact that if we were doing a deep dive, that would take up the whole night, one of these subjects. And the elements, in some cases, the sub-elements would take up the entire night. So it is that, if you think about it, going to the movies, I'm not sure who goes to the movies anymore, but you have those trailers and those previews, and then you have the movie itself. I usually look at those trailers and say, okay, what do I want to see next? And what don't I want to see next? Think of it the same way. We're going to give you the trailers tonight. Tell us what you want to see next. So that's really, our call to action throughout tonight for everybody that's participating. I'll ask for comments from the panel, the co-chairs. If not, we're going to jump right in.
Yeah, hey guys. So my name's Azam. I actually work with Sujit. As much as we kid, I'm definitely under his wing. He's a very hard worker and it's been great working with him. So I'm with Ironwood. I actually just graduated fellowship about 2 years ago. So this is my first venture out of training. From Chicago originally, did all my training in the Midwest. My wife is GI, so we both got jobs out here in Phoenix. And yeah, I'm just fresh in and just kind of building confidence and building clinical experience, but definitely excited to join. I agree with all you guys that finance and all of these administrative things are a gap in knowledge we all have. So thank you for putting this on.
Thanks, Sam. Ahmad, I see you. Just one press away from unmuting.
Yes. Hi. Good evening, everybody. I'm Ahmad Zarzour, medical oncologist in Toledo, Ohio, with Toledo Clinic. 2 years out of fellowship, did my fellowship at Northwestern in Chicago. I practiced there for a year and then moved here to Toledo about a year ago. Very excited about this program. I've talked to Joel and Tony about this program a lot, and I'm really excited.
I can go next. Hi, I'm Shelly. I actually work with Bimmel up in Epic Care in East Bay. So I'm located in Dublin and Castro Valley in California. I actually just completed my fellowship in July of last year. I did my fellowship training at Harbor UCLA down in LA, but I moved back to the Bay Area where I'm originally from. So thank you so much for putting this program together. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Thank you, Shelly.
Hey, everyone. I think I may be at the top just because of the A in the first name. So sorry if I'm out of order here. Andrew Sachaki, malignant hematologist. I'm with Cancer and Hematology of Western Michigan in Grand Rapids, Michigan. 2 years out from fellowship, did my training at Vanderbilt. And I just appreciate all of your time on an evening to go through all of this.
Thanks for joining us.
Hi, this is Bilal Farwana. I am 3 years into fellowship. I practice in St. Louis, Missouri. I am part of an 8 partners and I just became a partner about a year ago.
Hey, Joel, thanks for having me. I'm Joe Moore, part of Cancer Center of Kansas, based out of Wichita, Kansas. I'm a year out of fellowship, did most of my training in Texas, and then finished fellowship at MD Anderson. So happy to be here.
Hi, this is Rohan Gupta. I'm one of the oncologists in Fort Worth. Great to see you guys, and Shelley, especially. We were co-fellows in Harbor UCLA and City of Hope program. So I'm in Dallas, Fort Worth now. I'm looking forward for this program.
It's great. Welcome.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophia. I'm 3 years out of fellowship. I work with Dr. Fontaine over at New Mexico Cancer Center. I trained at University of Miami. And as everyone's echoed, we spent many years training how to hopefully become good at and excellent at patient care, but maybe not so much about, managing a practice, being mindful of challenges to come for community oncology, finances. So just very appreciative for your expertise and your time with us today.
Well, I might tap into you just from the standpoint, my daughter is going to U next year, and you have to tell me how to keep her out of trouble, because that is a dangerous environment down there.
We'll talk offline for sure.
Yeah, well, welcome.
Thanks.
And I don't have to listen from you, but if there's any others, feel free to.
Dr. Reddy, I
there we
think,
go.
is waiting.
Yes, there she is.
Hi, I'm Dr. Aretha Reddy. I am partners with Andy Sachaki, who had introduced himself earlier. I'm also 2 years out from fellowship and a part of Cancer and Hematology Centers of Western Michigan in Grand Rapids. I primarily focus on breast oncology, and I trained at the University of Michigan and have been in Michigan most of my training career. And thank you all for inviting us to join this great program.
Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, my name is Rob Havard. I work with Utah Cancer Specialists. I'm 3 years out of training. I did fellowship at Huntsman Cancer Institute, but have bounced all around the country for other medical training. Looking forward to the program. Thanks.
For being a part of it.
And then Dr. Koo, I believe, is on.
Yes, hello. So I'm Kimberly Koo. I work at Illinois Cancer Care. I'm in Bloomington, Illinois right now. And I'm 3 years out of fellowship. I trained at University of Wisconsin. And I'm really interested in this program because I'm on partnership track. I actually could have been partner earlier, but I put things on hold. I should recently have my third son. So if I'm ever not on mute, you'll probably hear some screaming in the background. So, but thanks for putting this together. I'm really looking forward to it.
All right. So again, should be light. Feel free to unmute as needed. We definitely want to hear from you. That's the only way that this discipline approach moves towards, incremental value for you. And you'll see the same thing on Thursday as well. So why don't we just jump on into there's 4 buckets. The first one being the healthcare situation analysis. And again, this is meant to be an introduction to get your feedback. And it could be, mechanisms as far as, conversation tonight. We'll do a little bit of audience response, and then there'll be a post survey that'll be sent out right after the program. And we would really appreciate your feedback with that. So why don't we go on the next slide, Brian? So I'm just going to kick it off. I mean, this is meant to be the macro side. So there is just the world that you have entered into. There are so many elements to be a leader with not only the community, but how this fits within the whole macro environment, that it's just so diverse and there's such complexity with it. Next slide. And I think everybody would agree. You can see these and pick these off of the wire everywhere, which is there's a lot of pressure in healthcare. So when you look as far as, the lower right with the priorities as far as public stuff is concerned, it's the economy and then it's healthcare cost. You look at the healthcare organization's challenges, which is diversity of the model. You look upper left, which is affordable care and diversity of care and making sure that, folks have access to care. And then you look at total expenditures and you look at the way it's outstripping GDP, there's just challenges. And we're in 2022 and the hurdles are there. And that's from a macro expectation. So that really leads to a lot of decisions that are done by the administration. We saw some things of the Trump administration. We're seeing some things of the Biden administration. These have a trickle down effect. So when you look at what you do, there's the macro and micro. The macro puts pressure on the micro. And I think right now there is challenges. And I think there is getting access to care. There's there's the models out there that say that these expenditures are not sustainable. And then it's on the minds of every consumer, which is the expense of healthcare. Next slide. So to that point, when we start thinking about community oncology, and we'll start having discussion on that, just in general. So part of this is an ARS, audience response. So you can press, A, B, C, D, and E as a mechanism when we say to vote, and we'll just generate this response. This is about your view of the future of community oncology. You're newly immersed into this, and I'm sure you're optimistic about it, but just in general, is it the future so bright I have to wear shades? Our ability to provide quality care is our competitive advantage. For the sustainability side, confronting challenges will be a consistent theme. Investment in specialties should be considered with significant caution. And then moving to the draconian side, which is practice consolidation is inevitable, and you'll have these super pods that are treating patients in the community. If you can vote right now, that would be great. Thank you. Okay. And I'll always, co-chairs, if you want to make a comment, we could move on. But yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. Confronting challenges. I mean, it's been historic, but I think they're coming at a faster degree than I've seen in 27 years in the space. Okay, so let's go to the next ARS. This question is related to, obviously, you're part of a team at your practice. The next question, if you can put it up, Brian. Yeah, well, so this one has a word change. Same answers or options, but what is your practice's view on the future of community oncology? So your leadership within the practice that you are currently at, what is their view of the future of community oncology? If you can answer now. Okay. Very similar. Okay, thank you. Any comments or? Okay.
I think I have to agree with the rest of my colleagues. I mean, being in community oncology with, our ability to provide not just quality care, but lower cost quality care, I think is our competitive advantage. And we're always going to be confronting challenges with, the university, the hospitals in our community. So I think we're all seeing the same thing no matter where we are.
Yeah. And we'll get into a little roundtable on it, but I think it's very helpful. So next slide. So when we look at the micro of just the current community landscape, this isn't a complete list, but the challenges are all around the community oncology practices, from 340B and just acquisitions to PBMs. And Josh, I didn't see you squint there. Every time I say PBM, you just get this look like he's eating a lemon. So, and I get why, and we'll get into that throughout today. Alternative payment models, how that's changing every day. So just you pulled just like recent news off the wire. I mean, it's changing every day, and it's very difficult for big organizations to make quick movements and be very reactive to the marketplace because it's not showing itself. So there's not a lot of planning that can go into it. Unfortunately, I think what we're seeing post-COVID is a lot of staffing challenges. So DR fees and step therapy is a consideration, and new administration policy decisions. So there's just a lot that happens within the space as far as what this landscape looks like. And that's where it gets into where you were, the folks who were participating in the ARS, where those are just challenges that are today. I think we're going to be confronted with challenges throughout that are going to be related to these elements, but other elements that are going to surface down the road as well. And the resilience of the community practice, I think, is going to be the greatest strength moving forward. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into each of these elements. I think there is that strategy, what it looks like. I think it's if you have the ability to maintain independence, maintain independence. I think it's you have the ability to provide that highest quality care. You have the ability to flex to your decisions. You have the ability to obviously provide to the employees that are part of your practice. So that's part of that leadership. And I think there's a lot of incentives to do that. And on the other side of it is aggregation, is the ability to look at areas of aggregation that will provide you benefits, and having that level of creativity will serve practices well in the future. Next slide. So just a snapshot, and again, it's not meant to be, a depressing conversation, but there are challenges within the space. So you have, right with the grid of just, different tumors and just, diversity of care and what that's afforded to and the rates of performance over time. But the other side, when you look at the community oncology practice, is, the reality is there are practices closing. There are ones that are struggling financially. There are ones that are sending patients elsewhere. There are, a high degree that are being acquired by hospitals. And then there's some that are practice merged or acquired. And most of it's based off of the changing dynamics in the landscape, quite frankly. I think it's, there's changes on the payer side, there's changes on the operation side, there are changes on just, what a practice is able to provide and how they maintain a level of profitability while they provide that. That's the reality. Now, if we're saying that we want to put a fence around community oncology, it's critically important to understand what elements are influencing these trends. Next slide. And I'm stealing a Suja slide here is, one area that we do focus in on is this 340B. So there are challenges as far as hospitals to independent community oncology centers because there is a tilted benefit on the economics associated with drug reimbursement with 340B that is quite frankly unfair, and I think it's inappropriate. But that being said, it creates leverage for these 340B institutions, where it is, the opportunity to make a certain, significant rebate off of expensive drugs and their ability or their desire to bring in, a greater degree of oncology providers. And usually it's driven from acquisition of community practices or bringing in community physicians. And then you start moving into the healthcare plans and the preferred contracts they have. And then the joint initiatives within the hospital. So there are challenges out there. I mean, I'm not here to paint a bold and audaciously bad picture, but there's challenges. And I think having, eyes wide open to what those challenges are and understanding them for where our participants are, will allow you to create creative solutions. I think that's what's necessary to the model is creative, energetic solutions that creates a diversification that puts a fence around this model. Next slide. So this is where we get to the conversation part of it, and you can have me shut up a little bit here, is just a round table. I just put 3 questions here. I always look at, quality care in the center. So if you look at the Visio on the right, quality care in the center, and there's 4 principal partners with it: practices, the pharmaceutical companies, patients, and then the payers. And you could, the payers subsidize or they outsource a lot of the benefits on the orals to the PBM. So I layer them into that grid right there. But really, those are the elements that play a significant role into where the win-lose is, the lose-lose, the win-win models are within your specific region. But when we look at the 3 questions on the left for the co-chairs, what do you think the greatest, current challenge facing your practice is?
So I think I'll take that question. I think our biggest survival issues primarily come from number one, competitions from the hospital, which is unfair. Like you said, with the 340B programs, if you're facing better EMR technology that they have available, less amount of pressure from the GPOs and getting the pricing discounts because they're able to buy as part of a hospital-based alliance, which can be favorable, better facility-based fees. And yet they're not nimble enough. So that's why they've still not been able to completely destroy community practice. Their overhead is quite high. They don't understand the left hand from the right hand. Administrators change every 3 to 4 years. So there's a lack of continuity in the vision and thought of how the cancer center is progressing. So I think community oncology will be here 20 years from now, 40 years from now, will still be here. It's just that we have to be cautious about who we go to bed with, what kind of relationships we make with the hospitals, with other things, and those are the big challenges.
Josh, you got any comments to that?
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, our practice right now is facing significant challenges around competition from the hospital. I mean, I'm optimistic, though. I want to definitely say that I'm optimistic. I agree that community oncology is going to be around for a long time, and I think we're going to see over the next 10 or 20 years that community oncology is going to grow and thrive. The pendulum that has swung one way with hospital acquisitions is going to go the other way. We just to echo some of the comments that were just made. The hospitals are very inefficient. They don't have
No es de
vision.
medicina, sino como de
They don't necessarily have the vision that's required in order to provide high quality, easily accessible care. And we're starting to see things shift a bit. We, for the last year or so, have been having now conversations with payers who, through their own data, are recognizing the things that we've been saying for years and years around community oncology providing the highest quality, highest value care. And they're starting to finally think about having conversations about preferred status within their networks. So I think, over the next decade, with any luck, we'll start to see hospitals have a harder time recruiting volume to their cancer centers because they're so costly. And that'll allow us to continue to provide that high quality, high value care.
Thanks, Josh. Bimal, I'm coming to you on the second one here is how do you manage the short-term priorities? Because this stuff's coming at you fast and furious, right? But also maintain long-term strategic planning. How do you balance those two things?
So I think I would agree that when you're coming out as a physician and you're just trying to understand the basics after your academic journey is done into a professional journey that you've started, where as a leader, you have to eventually, when you get to the point, manage your day-to-day activities and then keep an eye on the long view. So it comes with, in my judgment, experience and having managed crisis on short-term basis while continuing to be able to live and see the trends that are futuristic. I think what you don't know is hard to do anything about. So it is important to build that strength where you are able to, as a future leader, see the trends, incorporate their ramifications to your practice, to your business, to your position in the ecosystem, and plan on a parallel path as you're managing the short-term priorities. So it's not easy. It's not as easy as walking and chewing gum together, but it comes once you get there to be like that, because you do have everyday activities that you need to manage, where there's staffing, clinical operations, financial strength, and making sure that everything you're doing for your patients with quality, safety, and staying on a cutting edge care as physicians. And on top of that, continuing to make sure that your the purpose of your existence, the vision, the mission continues to maintain itself in your local marketplace. So it's not something that I can tell you in one thing and what and how you can go about doing it, but it's hopefully the kind of discussion this meetings would lay the foundation for the younger physicians who are on the path of leadership and awareness.
That's great.
Joel, if I can add something quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just one other quick comment along those lines. I think it's also critically important when trying to look at long-term strategic planning and managing crises and things for physicians, especially those in leadership roles, to develop trusting relationships with the leadership that exists within the practice, be it physicians or other administrators, operations folks, directors. Developing those trusting relationships, I think, can aid the physician leader significantly. And that's one of the areas of success I think we've had in our practice, because we have a very collaborative leadership team that works together to solve problems and build strategic plans.
That's a great point. So, and Ned, I'm coming to you on the last one here is, so you have the 4 Ps on the right. And again, I think it's a holy grail if they ever can come together in a spiritual way. But can they, do you think there is common ground that would allow quality care that can provide an insulation to the specialty? Because right now, it just seems like there's a lot of turf wars. You know, you can pick which ones you want on that side, but do you think there's a common ground? You know, usually people say obviously quality patient care, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I think not that it's just possible. I think we have to make it possible, that we should be working, you know, together with our payers. And, you know, we're doing that in our practice, you know, going to them and, you know, discussing value-based initiatives with the payers, you know, because they want us to provide good quality, lower cost care for their members. So, you know, they have an incentive to work with us. So I think we should work with them. And in the same with pharma, right? I mean, we can't do our job without pharma. They're bringing these, you know, new drugs to market. I think working with them on clinical trials so that they develop the type of therapies that are important to us and to our patients, you know, engaging them so that they're providing, you know, copay assistance to patients that need it, free drugs, you know, and certainly listening to the voice of our patients. I mean, we may be designing what we think is the best care for the patients, but we have to listen to their needs and understand the gaps in their care. And so that, you know, as a practice, we can really provide the best quality care. So the 4 Ps have to come together.
It's very well said. Any other comments from the co-chairs on it? Okay. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So, I mean, that's a great bridge, Annette, on the drug side. So when we have the element around drug development, that brings in the pharmaceutical company into the engagement. And depending on your experience with it, it could be favorable and negative, you know, quite frankly, but they have to be a partner. And I think there's certain organizations out there that are doing it right. So we're fortunate to have Gilles Galat with us, who's at Daiichi Sankyo, and he's the global director on the drug development side with Daiichi. And if you're familiar with Daiichi Sankyo, they're a new organization into oncology, but right now I think literally the news wire is flooded with what they're doing on the asset development standpoint. ASCO was, you know, quite frankly, a crowning achievement of the effort that Gilles and his collective group have put forward. It was, I think, the first standing ovation, a plenary session since Herceptin in 2005. And, you know, it is about, you know, pushing and moving the needle forward on what the expectation is from these pharmaceutical companies on delivering high value, high quality care. And, you know, us as an organization, we're very critical of the pharmaceutical side. And we do not do a tremendous amount with them because that's not in the spirit of what our mission is. But when you find an organization like Daiichi with the assets and their ability to evolve these assets in a way that are extremely provocative and relevant for cancer patients. And then number two, having an organization, and I've been working with them since they were entering in the space about 3 years ago, that have a commitment to the community sector. It is quite refreshing. So this is not an infomercial on Daiichi. This is giving a view into the way they think about asset development. And that appreciation is necessary because, you know, you look at what was in play through the Trump administration with most favored nations and the fact that it put a focus in on profitability from pharma companies and the design model of the United States versus other countries. And there was a tremendous amount of spillover effect that was negative. But I think when you start looking at, you know, it's a great opportunity, but at the same point, it's a double-edged sword as far as the challenge of an organization like Daiichi to make these type of investments that are, you know, millions, if not billions, and do the right thing. I think they've done it to this point, and what we wanted to do is give that, you know, impression from somebody that is directly engaged in that process and give you that point of view. So, Gilles, welcome to the Cofai Forum. We appreciate you being here, and take it on over.
Absolutely, thank you, Joel, and thank you for the invitation. I've been sitting in the back here listening, and it's a fascinating discussion that I've heard up to now. I'm very happy to be here tonight. We are doing more and more with community oncology, and I'll tell you why if you ask me the question after my short presentation. I have only a few slides here about Daiichi Sankyo, what we do. If you can go to the next slide, just to let you know that I'm the global head of oncology drug development. So I'm really on the R&D side. And so it means don't ask me anything about commercial or marketing or anything like that. I have nothing to do with this. So my role is really global. My group we are a Japanese company at the origin. And by the way, we're a more than 100 years old company. It's not a recent company. And my global group is mainly based out of the US, where we have a very large group of physicians, and our group is growing tremendously right now. Most of them medical oncologists, but we have people with different specialties, neuro-oncologists and neurologists and all sorts of people that have very different backgrounds, which is very good for us in terms of diversity. Part of my group is also in Europe, where we do a lot of work. Of course, in Japan, where we're originally from, and in China as well. So next slide. So as I mentioned, we have what I would call a medium-sized company. So we're not a large pharma. And the company at the time of this slide was ranked 24th around the world. We're present in about 20 countries, a little bit more than that now. And we do R&D mostly out of the US and Japan. Our research folks are mostly in Japan. Translational is in Japan, but clinical is really mostly located in the US. About 5 to maybe 10 years ago, the company, which was mostly a company doing cardiovascular and metabolics kind of diseases, decided to really move the entire group towards oncology. And that was based on the fact that we, as a group, discovered, for example, irinotecan years ago, but always out-licensed this in different countries and work with different companies. But now, we took the step to really discover, develop, and ultimately market our drugs in oncology. So next slide. So you probably know about Enhertu, an important drug to us. This is our DXd ADC franchise. I'm not going to go into the details, but this is a totally novel ADC construct. And you saw in some of the results, how this drug actually improved significantly the outcome in patients in breast cancer with HER2 positive disease, but also in HER2 low disease. That's what Joel was mentioning at ASCO. I've been part of this Enhertu program for the past 5 years. And so I was at the inception of all those clinical trials that are now reading years after. In that franchise, we do have a TROP2 ADC, an HER3 ADC, B7H3, which is a IO target ADC, and cadherin-6. And as you can see, the target indication is really large, various, and we're developing additional ADCs in our pipeline. What's very unusual about our company is all these drugs, plus we have small molecules, not on this list. We have monoclonal antibodies, proteins, and different other agents in oncology. All of this have been discovered by Daiichi Sankyo. We haven't licensed any of those products. So that's fairly unusual in the industry. Next slide, please, Joel. And so we have access to very different technologies to develop drugs. So our researchers really looked at, what is the target, what is the etiology, and in what area should we work, and then decide which of those modalities you have here we're going to use and bring the drugs to unmet medical need. It is important for us. We don't want to create me too's. We want to create either best in class or first in class agents that are actually going to change standard of care. And HER2 is the first example of a series that we think we're going to be able to advance to patients. Next slide. So really for us, it's care, it's compassion, it's science-based, and it's really our obligation at Daiichi Sankyo. And we really believed in this. And I think when you talked a little bit earlier about quality care, how important it is for your groups, I think that part of the quality care now has to include clinical trials. Drugs that we study can really advance, the treatment of patients with different cancers. And patients now are really looking for places where those innovations are actually provided to them. And so let's talk a little bit about why it is important to work with community oncology, because I think that's something to me, that's what's really important out of this discussion tonight. What we're seeing in our clinical trials is less and less patients coming from the US. And this is significant. We do trials everywhere in the world. But what we see is the proportion of patients that are entering our clinical trials are less and less in the US. Those that actually enter in the US are actually coming mostly from community oncology sites, not from academic medicine centers. And this is important. And we're going to try to continue to expand our clinical research with community centers where patients actually are being treated. And that's going to remain something very important for us. Secondly, also extremely important for us is diversity. And by having very little recruitment of our patients in the US, we're not able to really have the diversity that
I got the electronic thing.
the FDA is asking for. So for many reasons, we feel that we're going to continue expanding our reach to community oncology sites for our clinical trials. So Joel, I stop here and maybe you have a question or two.
So I'll leave it to the group. I have one in particular because I think about, the impression of the decision tree from a major pharmaceutical company, right? And don't take this the wrong way, Gilles, but you're a cost center, right? You are, and it's a very big cost center, but you are the precipice to a profit driver. And again, these are for-profit companies. What does that decision tree look like from your perspective?
You mean in terms of where we're doing our studies or how we're doing our studies?
What drives it? Do you have a mantra, a platform? Is there something that's standardized within Daiichi that says this is where we're going to, and hopefully it doesn't sound trite, where we're going to place a bet, right?
Yeah. And so this of course is a constant discussion. As I mentioned, we have a very large pipeline. I just showed you a snippet of it. And so you have a finite amount of resources to develop the drugs. And so you have to look at, what are the possibilities? Where are the unmet medical need? Where can we actually bring those drugs as quickly as possible? So many different factors we consider in really where are we going to put our money? And of course, when you start having results like we have with HER2, that becomes a little easier for us to actually invest in a drug like this. But what people maybe don't know, so a little story behind the famous Destiny Breast 04 that we presented at ASCO with such stellar results in patients with HER2 low. I was there at the time, and we sat down, look at the results. We had only about 50 patients worth of data on similar patients, with only a response rate which was around 40%, and very unusual for a HER2 targeted agent. But it was still an enormous risk to take and bring this into a large phase 3 multinational study. And we really believe this drug would make a difference. And so these are some of the risks that you have to take at some point. And then at the end, you get a standing ovation at ASCO, and everybody is extremely emotional. But when we wrote that study, we didn't have a final dose. We actually established a dose very quickly and then put it in the protocol and then started the study everywhere around the world. So these are the stories you don't see because, nobody talks about that. But this was a big risk, and you have to convince your management that this is where they should put their money.
That's great. Any other questions?
Yeah, Joel, can you, Gales, I don't know if you're involved in product development. So what's relevant for these guys who are here is, can you talk about when you develop these trials, how do you select the practices? How do you go to the CROs? What are you looking for community oncologists to come by? What are the kind of criteria that they require if somebody is interested in writing an investigator-initiated trial or becoming a published author on one of your major trials? What are the requirements? Can you speak on any of those, or is that outside your purview?
No, it's absolutely. We always work with CROs. So Daiichi Sankyo, of course, is building right now. We're growing, and we're getting more people around us. But when those trials that I talked about were designed, we had limited people, and so you rely a lot on CROs, which is not the best way because they tend to recommend certain sites. And it's unfortunate because often the sites they're going to select usually are the ones that can start very rapidly. And that's okay as long as you bring me patients in my study. And often what you see is those sites that start rapidly do not actually enroll with our study. So the potential for enrollment is extremely important. I talked a little bit about diversity also. If your community is actually very diverse, it is important for us, and we would probably put a site that has a diverse population in front of a site that does not. I think you have to have an infrastructure, unfortunately, to do clinical trials. We do clinical trials, most of them, of course, for registrational purposes, which means we have to follow FDA guidelines. And so in order to do that, you usually have to have, managers of clinical research, for example, to enter the data in our electronic databases. You need to have research nurses often because you would take some blood samples of those patients for PK purposes or things like that. So you have to have some infrastructure to do this. Now, the earlier studies that you do, for example, phase 1, you would require more of this infrastructure. When you go to phase 3, you usually take much less, you need much less to run those studies. I think that's also considerable. What is important also is reaching a contract with the institutions. And so one trend that we've seen recently in the recent years is that academic centers now are asking for so much. They're asking for so much money as well. And so your community centers are becoming more and more competitive as well. And so that's very important. So this is for company-sponsored trials, which are very important. We do also work with investigator directly to do investigator-sponsored studies. That's absolutely possible. The way that it works, we usually ask for a page or two describing what the nature of the study would be, how many patients, what kind of patients, and so on. And we have a website on I think it's IIS at Daiichi Sankyo or something like that. It's on our website that you submit this, and then that goes through evaluation. And then there's possibilities to receive some, sponsorship to do those things, but it's entirely under the IND of the investigator. So we do that as well. It is more open for drugs that are more advanced, drugs that are on the market, or drugs that are in phase 3. When drugs are much earlier in their lifespan, in phase 1 or phase 2, that's a little bit more tricky because we're still evaluating safety. And so usually those studies are company-sponsored studies.
Gilles, that's great. I appreciate the view behind the curtain. That's what we're trying to represent to the group here. So we really appreciate you joining us tonight. And we thank you for that very eye-opening view into the effort that Daiichi is doing to impact patient lives. So thank you very much. And it's a good segue into Annette, who's going to run through top line on clinical trials and just a practices perspective. And Gilles, you're more than welcome to stay on throughout the program here. So Annette, feel free to take us through that, that preview, because this could be a 3-day course, right? There's just so much complexity, and just there's no two practices the same. But again, just a top line flavor of just the way that you amongst the co-chairs view clinical trials.
Yeah, and I would love for Gil to stay for that section at least. I think I have a slide I need him to comment on.
Okay.
All right, good. So yeah, we can move to the next slide. Thank you so much for that introduction into clinical trials. And we're starting with an ARS question. So for participants on a physician level, what do you think are the barriers to participating in clinical trials? So I'm sure some of you have a research department in your practice, and are you actively participating? And if not, why not? Do we have the response? So yeah, so the majority of people feel that typically the trials that are in their practice are not appropriate for the patient population, or they have inadequate time to discuss during the patient visit, or lack of familiarity with the trial. Okay. Next slide. So, for those of you who have been in the practice for a while, what are the challenges that your practice is facing in building a research program? Is it staffing, finding the right trials, identifying patients for existing trials, or engaging your physicians in enrolling patients? So staffing is a huge issue, and I think we're all facing that, trying to find research coordinators, or nursing with research experience, or with an interest in research, or managers.
Annette, can I interrupt you there?
Yes.
So can you just briefly elaborate on what you've done to face these challenges in recruitment, and what exactly has your practice actually faced?
Yeah, so my practice is facing the challenge of staffing our research department. So we have had to strategically look at, what are the trials that we should be bringing into the practice that requires minimal staffing. We are also looking at working with, as a group, with outside practices, right? So right now we're part of a group called X-Cancer. So instead of having our own staff that does, the trial and looking at the IRB, X-Cancer provides, getting the documents to the IRB. They provide the contracting, looking at, how much money we should be making. They have the staff that put together, the summaries of the trials, so that it's easy for physicians to learn the inclusion-exclusion criteria. They have a dashboard that we can easily access in the room, look at the trials and get the patients on the trials. And they provide support to us by, having meetings, regular meetings with us, in discussions about what is the right trial for our patient population. So I think that that's one of the ways we have overcome some of our challenges.
So I think across the meeting, I think we'll make this a theme when we identify a problem to discuss how our practice has put the solutions, because at the end of the day, this is about understanding the solutions that everybody has already faced and expanding it. So I'll quickly give you 1, 2, 3 of what we have done at Ironwood. Number one, the staffing issue we've had is that all our staff gets stolen by either the hospitals or the CRO because they offer better healthcare benefits, better pay. So we really ramped up our insurance, group insurance funding and such to make sure we don't lose personnel. Number two, arranging flexible hours and allowing them to work at home to some extent is something that we have done that has helped in retention. Number three, the big issue is having too many requirements in the front line for tissue testing. Even though we like to have everything targeted, we've tried to have trials where we don't have that. So we don't, like Annette said, we don't need a whole lot of FTA hours in recruiting those patients. That's what we have done. And number four, we have stayed away from phase 4 trials because we don't think they really help us. They don't help the patient. So we're really stuck to phase 2 and phase 3. Josh, can you quickly say 1 or 2 things, maybe quickly then before we move on in the solution?
Sure, we have done many of the same things, partnered with outside organizations such as X-Cancer and others like them locally to help provide support for contract budgeting, et cetera. There are other organizations that can also provide staffing support when you are short on CRCs to fill gaps when you have open studies. And then I think one thing that you just said that's extremely important is shifting away from the phase 4. And I think there's a trend now to shift away to some extent from phase 3 because the I&E criteria for phase 3 can be so difficult for some trials. So looking at phase 2 and sometimes even some of the phase 1s with simple pharmacokinetic portions can be really beneficial for patient recruitment.
Thank you. Next.
All right, so we'll jump right into our next ARS question. So what do we think is important for a successful research program? And we see the responses. So the majority of you, indicate that it's the culture of the practice. And again, as Sudip is saying, how do we make research, right? The culture of our practice. And it's understanding the importance of research, actually, as Gil said in his presentation, right? That's the way we advance science. Through clinical trials, we're providing more, treatment opportunities for patients. And patients are having better quality of life, living longer with their cancer. So it's important that we have clinical trials and, being in community oncology and understanding the challenges of survival. We know that clinical trials is also a huge revenue stream for the practice. The drug margins are disappearing, and clinical trials is the way to stay in business. Next slide. So Gil gave us, the pharma side of clinical trials, right? What they have done at Daiichi Sankyo, and that's similar to what other pharma is doing. But on the community oncology side, we have to look at clinical trials as an important part of our business. We know it's important to our patients, but it's important to us to stay in business. And therefore, the types of trials that we want to look at, registry trials that are quick, easy to get patients accrued to, trials that are profitable for the practice. And certainly, I think Sudip mentioned earlier, when you look at, cooperative trials, they require a lot of work, a lot of staff hours, but very little revenue to the practice. And you'll see that in community oncology, we're moving more and more away from these cooperative trials for these reasons and more into the pharma trials that are easier.
Annette, can I ask you one line question? Just one line answer. in your practice, what percentage of trials are cooperative group or some kind of arrangement like that? How much of them are CRO? What percentage is through pharma directly?
Yeah, so right now we are at almost 0% cooperative group trials because we've broken away from our university alliance program that provided the cooperative group trials and moving, almost 100% into pharma trials.
Josh?
Through ex-cancer, yeah.
We're the exact opposite. 90% of our patients are accrued to a cooperative group trial and 10% are industry, and we're trying to flip that upside down.
At Ironwood, we're at 100% pharma trials. We found that we just can't sustain the model with the cooperative group trials. Bimal? You're on mute, Bimal.
Sorry, yeah, I was on the mute. I was just unmuting. So yeah, no, we used to have a clinical research indigenously in our practice for years, and we decided to stop that because we were having very hard time to continue to maintain it. And we've recently been mostly involved by in an alliance with our local M Corp, which is this old C Corps, if you will, in the community. And so most of our trials are just like Josh's group cooperative trials, because most of the trials on the menu of the M Corps are alliance trials.
Thanks. All right, Annette, back to you.
Okay, next slide. Great to hear the different perspectives of the different practices there. So, this is the punchline, right? So on a daily basis, we have a list of patients, 20 plus patients that we're seeing. And when we look at the revenue that we get, right, 99214 or 99215, look at what we get from Medicare, right? Or even from our commercial payers. Whereas on average, if that patient is on a clinical trial, we can make 10 times as much money for the practice. So we are providing another treatment opportunity for the patient, and we are providing exponential amount of revenue to our practice. So, when you look at that slide, it says everything why we need clinical trials to survive in community oncology. Next slide. So we know that, and we saw it on the earlier slides, everybody is saying, it's difficult to accrue patients to clinical trials because we just may not have the right trials for our patient population. So typically we will see only about 2% of our patients are accrued, right? But if we have the right budget for the clinical trials, if we have the right trials with the right budget, we can see that we still can make, good revenue for our practices. So if we take a practice with 8 medical oncologists and 2% of their patients are accrued on clinical trials, and we do the math, right? We're saying that we have a budget of about $23,000 per patient on the trial. Next slide. So that would amount to $4.4 million in revenue per year for that practice with only 2% of their patients, an 8-physician practice. So what about pharma? And that's where I want Gil to comment. So looking on Google, this is what I found that, pharma spend on these different phases, right? So on a phase 1, anywhere from, and I believe it was per year. So Gil can comment on that.
Yeah, and quickly, Annette, these are very, very low numbers.
Okay.
It might be old numbers. Clinical trials are way more expensive than that now. Okay. And the fact that we use CROs, that's a good proportion of the trials. And just one comment, you mentioned participation to clinical trials. For me personally, I much prefer you tell me I cannot enroll in this clinical trials than you accept to do a clinical trials and you don't enroll. because that's costing me money and that's costing you money as well. And so that's not good for anybody. But these numbers you can multiply by big factors to the reality. It's much more than that.
Yeah, so that's why I'm glad we're here, because that was on Google, and I figured that it was an underestimate, but when you look at the phase 3 trial, right, which is pretty much what the majority of us would be accruing patients to, would you say, it's this median cost of 41,000 per year makes sense?
It's actually more than that. And it all depends, number of patients, first of all. So phase 3 at 20 million doesn't exist anymore. That's years ago. But a median cost per patient is much higher, particularly if you have several visits, if you have biopsies or blood work, extra blood work or extra CT scans you have to perform, or that you have an external committee that reviews all the scans. There are many, many different costs that are involved here. And
just to throw in, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to throw in some numbers, which is relevant for the participants here. An average injectable versus an average oral drug on a phase 2 and phase 3 program. Josh, in your program, what's your average reimbursement from the CRO for a phase 2 trial, oral versus injectable? And similarly, what's it for a phase 3 on an oral and an injectable, roughly speaking? Ballpark number.
22,000 for an oral and 35 for an injectable.
Annette?
I don't have those numbers in my head.
So Josh's numbers are right on spot. That's exactly what we have at Ironwood. It's about 22 to 28,000 for orals. That's what we last saw. And for injectable, it's anywhere from 32 to 36. And then like Gil said, the CROs generally have a cut of anywhere from 30 to 40% over that. So right there, your expense per patient gets to about 55, 60. So that's what you can expect if you're running a practice, when you're negotiating with the CROs, when negotiating from the pharma. That's the bottom line numbers you got to be looking at if you're running a clinical research practice in your system. All right, thanks. Next.
And just don't forget also the duration, because, for example, when we do HER2 studies and patients are on trials for 3, 4, sometimes 5 years, the amount of it's really a yearly amount that we're talking about.
That's why the cooperative groups have not succeeded, because they pay an average 8 to 12,000, and they have 4-year survival data that we have to accumulate. It's impossible for us to do that. That's why we have to give up cooperative group trials. All right, Annette, back to you.
Yes, so great point. And I think, this discussion is telling us, the value of these clinical trials to our practices, that there is money to be made if we can find the right trials for a patient population. Next slide. Yeah, so we talked about, in the ARS questions, the challenges that we face, right? And staffing is a huge problem. And therefore not trying to do it all, but working with groups like, Josh's group, my group, we work with X-Cancer, other people work with, cooperative groups. But that way we can share staff and, thinking of innovative ways to keep staff. As Sudip said, with COVID, we've had to have staff work from home, and, they have a better quality of life and they're still getting the job done. So, these are ways that we are able to keep the department going. Talking about finding the right trials to participate in. As Gil said, it costs our research department a lot of money, because you constantly are screening patients, you're paying staff to review data, and we are not getting any patients on the trial. So it's important that we are able to get the right trials for a patient population. But I'm sure you're having the same challenges that we have. We have this EMR, and within the EMR, it's how do we generate those reports that can actually tell us which patients actually meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria. I don't know, Sudip, if you guys are using tools within your practice, or Josh, or BIMA, and any tools within your practice that helps you to identify, because that's a huge challenge.
So we have OncoEMR, and they have a tool called OncoAssist. So we feed in all the programs, we feed in all the research trials that we have with the disease-specific inclusion-exclusion criteria. So for instance, stage 4 lung cancer. So what it does is automatically generates a list every week of the patients who are coming in that week for that particular diagnosis and who may fit in. And it's been a big improvement with OncoAssist, and that's been helping us quite a bit.
Thank you for that. Anybody else have any other tools that you're using that's looking at the data behind the scenes, mining the data that gives you that sort of information? And the participants, you know, if you guys have something in your practice, feel free to speak up as well. I'd be happy to know what's happening.
Yeah, I think one quick thing for all the participants, the more questions you ask in the chat box, we can actually tailor this program to your needs. So more the questions you bring in, the better off we are. So don't feel shy. Please go ahead and type away.
Yeah, and we'll either introduce them or we'll handle them off, you know,
The next program, we can always do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can handle the question. You can view the results and everything like that, just for the sake of time, because
Right.
I think we're gonna have to stretch the legs here and get the legs moving faster.
Okay, good. So the next challenge is engaging physicians in patient enrollment. And that's so critical, because the physicians are the ones that seeing the patients, that's talking to the patients about the trial, and that can definitely be a challenge. So to have a successful program, what we have identified is really to have a culture within the practice that the first option for treating a patient in every physician mind has to be clinical trial. Before you think of standard clinical trial. And we're moving within our EMR into incorporating those clinical trials into our pathways. So that way, when you're clicking the treatment options, clinical trials is number one. You can't miss it. We're also looking at, you know, ensuring that we have clinical trials for every stage of a disease. So especially for the big, you know, the big ones, breast cancer, prostate, lung cancer, if we can have clinical trials from stage 1 to stage 4, then we'll have more patients, you know, on trials, and definitely easy access of the clinical trial information at the point of care. If the doctor has to move from the EMR to an outside site, you're going to lose them. It has to be within the EMR, click a button, access the clinical trial information, and have that discussion. Next slide.
That was great. Thank you for that. And again, like we said, this is just the top line. We could be digging into this for, you know, days on end. So your response and your feedback, if this is an area that you want depth to, that's the point of tonight. So between drug development, and obviously it's a natural segue into clinical trials. You know, when you get the survey, let us know what you're thinking, because this is just the tip of the iceberg of what that conversation looks like. So we're going to move into, Suja's going to give just a really top line, the relevancy of what's happening on the legislation. So to me, it skews a little bit more of protections, right? OIG, and understanding what that landscape is. And just, again, a preview of just the magnitude where it's always been out there, but I think we are in, you know, a world that we're not coming back from, which is, you know, protections, making sure that you're doing the right things from a practice perspective, because at the end of the day, you know, you're the leaders of the practice, where, you know, you need to insulate the practice. And one of the biggest areas of downside liability is not fulfilling your obligation to what the OIG manages from compliance measures. So just, I know you got a ton in here, but, you know, feel free to give a top line and take it on over.
Okay, next slide. So here's the issues. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Stark Law, but none of you have learned this in fellowship or in residency. You heard it exists, you heard it's relevant, and if you have a default, you'll have 4 blue suits sitting in your office trying to put you in jail, right? I mean, this is scary.
Yeah, and then hopefully you avoid the pinstripes, right?
That's right. That's right. The blue suits are okay, not the pinstripes. All right.
Yeah.
So first we're going to talk about the Stark Law. I'm going to have to go through this quickly. This is top line. If you guys feel there's an interest in this, I can come back and give a more detailed setting. So the first thing is the Stark Law was entered in 1989. It essentially was to prevent physicians from referring physicians to entities where they have an existing relationship and stand to benefit financially. So that's why it's got called anti-kickback. What does this apply to? It applies to practically everything that the CMS is going to give a dime out to. And that is called as DHS, the designated health services. DHS, anything that CMS makes a payment, they want to make sure you're not splitting between your family and knocking CMS out for a ride. So that includes laboratory services, radiation therapy, radiology, physical therapy, TPN, prosthetics, home health services, outpatient prescription drugs. So there is a work around it. And Josh is going to talk about that in the pharmacy setting as to how that is done. Inpatient and outpatient hospital services. Next. So these are the key exemptions. We're going to talk about some of these. I don't have time today, but certainly down the line, if you guys have questions, I can bring this up each individually. Employment exception. There's a personal services exception. FMV, fair market value. I'm going to refer to this several times in my presentation. Indirect compensation exception. In-office ancillary services. Academic medical centers are exempt, and isolated transactions exception, which is a one-time transaction. Next. So these are the main changes which came in 2021 and 2022. I'm going to just hit the highlights. This is probably the most ambitious change which happened in the last 15 years. What it attempted to do, and the government is not good at explaining regulation to us in a jiffy, and they always put all these 300,000 words in there, but they attempted to ease the administrative burdens and modify some key definitions, modify the FMV because it was outdated, and commercial reasonableness because a lot of things had changed since 2007. So they did value-based adjustments, and that allowed for exceptions based on formal collaboration between parties. And this had to be value-based because this was all tying in with the Obamacare and the value-based, and they allowed exemptions if this was done in the setting of value-based, meaning you contract with a hospital or a healthcare plan, and you're reducing the cost of care, some amount of money transactions between the two would be allowed based on that, and that is not a Stark Law violation. They also said that 5,000 is a reasonably small number, so they said that physician compensation limits of up to $5,000 between physician entities and DHS entities and physicians in a calendar year would be exempt. Number 3, they said they put in a cybersecurity exception. This allowed hospitals to come out and donate EMRs to favorable physicians. So if they had a good relationship with a physician company, they were allowed to donate significant components of the EHR free to you. And they could maintain this in the setting of services and pay for this for the next 7 years. So that actually created some alliances for the favorable physicians if they liked the hospital and if the hospital liked them to create this. And that was a workaround which happened. And then they clarified some of the definitions. Next. So the value-based arrangements, I'm going to talk about this very briefly. There are 3 exceptions that they placed. Number 1 was the value-based enterprise and the participants, they defined it. So they said there has to be a full financial risk when you're making these exceptions, meaning both parties need to be at a point where they may lose some dollars for this to be valid. If there is no dollar loss, these agreements would not be valid, it would be null and void, and it would be considered criminal. So to do that, the physician and his organization has to take on a meaningful downside financial risk. This went through Senate and Congress for nearly 16 months before they agreed on this number. And the ACC, and I was part of the committee which was lobbying for this, finally came up with a number of 10% that they're able to forego. You had to be willing to lose 10% of the income. And these value-based arrangements had to be on a system-based level and not on an individual level. Next. The commercial reasonableness, this was mostly to do with the current prevailing rates. And they also said, if you're in Miami, you can expect to get more. If you're in Phoenix, probably a little less. And if you're in the middle of Kentucky, probably a little less. So that was where they factored in, and they put in a factor on each one of these based on the, the inflation in that particular city and the cost of living, a lot of those things. And then the next was the value of the referrals and the other businesses cannot be guaranteed. It has to be in a very liquid phase, because if they're guaranteed, then they can put terms on that. So that again had to be spelled out. And then finally, I think we talked about establishing a fair market value. Previously, they required 3 outside adjudicators to decide what the FMV would be. But then they said in an arm's length transaction, you can go with general market value. And as long as that is in reasonable good standing, we'll accept that. So you don't have to have significant adjudication from outside agencies, thereby cutting down the regulatory steps for these agreements that you'd make, which would be stark exempt. Next. So there's the physician exceptions. I think I already alluded to the $5,000 aggregate per calendar year, which is exempt. And they also put in that it has to be through other avenues. Okay, next, we'll skip this one. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to kick back. So this is completely different than the Stark law. This is the anti-kickback statute, which was applied. There is a lot of overlap between the Stark law and the AKS. There are key safe harbors here. The personal services and the management contracts are exempt for both the hospital and the physician practice. Some of the employment, when it's co-shared, that's exempt as long as you're co-sharing human resources between the organizations. If you can show that, that is there. Practitioner recruitment is now allowed, so the hospital can participate in the hospital practitioner recruitment as long as you have the key safe harbor and there is a value generated to both the organizations. They can participate in the practitioner recruitment and be willing to pay for a part of it. So both the Stark and AKS, like I said, are complementary. They're not the same, but they still have distinct with very minor exceptions between the two. Next. So these are the 3 value-based arrangements that the anti-kickback statute allowed. Again, the theme is very similar to the Stark law. There has to be substantial downside financial risk, and there has to be an arrangement as to what happens when there's a full financial risk, and it has to be applied for at least a minimum of 1 year. Number 3, the personal services we talked about. Okay, next. So these are the other changes which were imposed in 2021, but got into effect in 2022. So they changed the group structure practice exemption. All clinical employees are employed or contracted within the physician group who are to participate in this. The physician pay and productivity bonus has offered an exception. The big change which happened here is, and there's a diagram, I hope we kept that slide next. It does not allow split pooling of the distribution model as to how this money which is obtained, which is Stark exempt, how this is split up. They made a big change in this. And it has to be groups of 5 or more physicians by specialty when you share it, and you cannot share it based on their productivity. I think I have a slide on this next. Can you, next please? We took that off. I think I'll come back and address that, but that's a key address is that there has to be significant amount of human resources sharing. The pods have to be created where there are 5 physicians per pod. All right, I think I'll
Sujit,
stop
that was
here.
great. That was fast. Yeah, I think I need to send you a towel because I'm sure you're
I know,
sweating
I had
after
to
that
do it
sprint
fast.
right
You
now.
said
But that's okay.
I have 6 minutes for the Stark law, so I don't have much there.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's meat on the hook to see if, again, it's not the takeaway. It's more, boy, I want to learn more about that. That's the key. So that's why, we're sensitive that it's, everybody's busy late night and that. So there's a speed that you notice here, but it's intentional just from a standpoint of, we just want your feedback from that. So
and this is the first talk. We'll obviously come back to these topics based on the
yeah.
feedback we receive. So obviously the Stark law, I think maybe may have to come back at some point. I have another 6 or 7 slides. We can put it at some point.
Yeah, and we talked about that. I mean, then we bring a firm in. So I bring Pepper Hamilton so you get the legal perspective as well. So that's the intent. So that was great, Sujit. Thank you. A lot of good stuff there. So Annette, back to you.
Yeah, so, very important happening across the country is really, access to care, disparities in care, and what are we doing as a practice? Why is that important? And in community oncology, we want to capture everybody in our community, in our practice, right? We are competing with the university, we are competing with the hospitals, and therefore we have to have something that's different to attract these patients to us. And, I'm sure you've been hearing in your practices about, the social determinants of health. So, as these patients come into our practices as new patients, it's really understanding more about them and not just their disease. So, we look in the EMR at their race, we have their address and their zip codes. We know that affects, how they do. But also important is, are they getting enough food? So having a mechanism within the EMR, within the practice of finding out about food security, housing security, what social support system do they have, access to transportation. So all of these are important, because if we ignore it, then we see the patient, we make a treatment plan, and they can't follow it because they're lacking these support systems. Next slide. So it's not enough to capture that information. So first of all, within our practice, these patients, every patient that comes within the practice has to have a new patient orientation class. They get to meet with our navigator. She, takes care of these questionnaires and finds out what they need: transportation, food, housing. And we have every patient meet with our financial counselors who go over their insurance, looks at the treatment plan, and provides, assistance for them. Do they need free drug? Do they need copay assistance? We developed within the practice a foundation that can provide for their non-medical needs. So the foundation pays for food or transportation, pays the rent so that they can have a place to live. As far as cultural diversity, again, this is a sensitive topic we're hearing across the country. As a group, we want to make sure that our staff is diversified, right? In New Mexico, we have, Native Americans, we have people, that are Mexicans, they speak mainly Spanish. So having staff that is able to speak to them in their native language, translate for them in person, if not online, so that they truly understand what we're saying. That is all part of access.
And this is a good topic. Can I have Bimal just comment quickly about how you maintain diversity within your staff to help you with your patient needs? What sort of measures have you taken to help with that?
So I think we obviously are in an area where there is significant diversity. And even though it's a major metropolis, we have naturally diversity in demographics, diversity in race, religion. So I think naturally it's not that difficult. It's not as monochromatic. It is in fact getting a bit monochromatic in the sense that it's a little bit more Asian centric, if you will, the demographics in at least in the Bay Area. And so we are having challenge to maintain diversity from, so to speak, at least physician perspective, because it tends to be that we attract more of a certain type or a certain background of physicians. Staffing wise, I think it's not as difficult. We have a, so to speak, we don't have a chief diversity officer or anything of that sort in a designated way, and that has become a pretty commonplace in corporate America in the last 5 years as this has become sociologically a sensitive topic. But I think we tend to just make sure that our staff and our physicians emulate more like what our communities look like, and we work towards and at differing points when we have options to pick and choose to maintain that diversity, or at least take that factor in account in the decision making of an open position.
All right, Annette, back.
Thank you, Bimal. Appreciate that. Next slide. Yeah, so again, another important factor in patient care is the ability to identify the patients that are at higher risk. And when we talk about higher risk, it's, looking at their medical condition and, at higher risk for complications, right? So not every patient is high risk, but identifying those and being able to intervene earlier is important. As a group, we're looking at tools that we can integrate into the EMR. Right now, we don't have them. We've been discussing them, and I would love to hear if any of you have specific tools that you're using, you know, one of the things that we have done is having a team approach to care. So, you know, we have, and I'm sure you have it in your practice, you know, we have the advanced practice clinicians, nurses, patient care coordinators, navigators, and especially our triage nurses. So we have systems within our treatment plan where the nurses are calling the patients at specific times in their treatment so that we can learn about any side effects they're having very early on and bring them to see a mid-level provider that can intervene, provide fluids, antiemetics. You know, our practice also have extended hours, even on the weekends, on a Saturday, so that instead of going to urgent care, we're taking care of them, reducing the number of emergency room visits and hospitalizations. And we've even gone into developing legislature to improve access to care. What was happening in our community, which I'm sure is happening in your community, is that you prescribe an oral drug that is very expensive, right? And maybe even before finishing the first cycle, the patient is having side effects where, you know, they cannot continue. You have to switch the drug. And then they have this full bottle of a drug that costs $13,000. And it's like, what do we do with this? Can we, you know? So our New Mexico Medical Society, we went to the medical society and discussed with them and was able to get a law that allows our patients to donate drugs as long as the container is still sealed. So our pharmacy will accept these drugs from the patient, and we are now able to donate that drug to other patients who can't afford it. Or sometimes while we are fighting with their insurance company, going through multiple appeals, the patient has already started treatment using donated drugs. So anybody can share any tools that you're using to identify these high-risk patients in your practice? Josh, do you have something built in?
We do have some tools. I can't speak to the exact tool that we use right now, but we do have tools built into our EHR that our nurse navigators use to identify patients who might benefit from our foundation. We have a foundation that's similar to what you described that we use for non-medical expenses to help patients who are at risk.
Thank you. So what about identifying the medically high risk? So not necessarily from a financial or social standpoint, but based on their comorbidities, that they're high risk to probably go to the ER or be admitted. Do you have anything that identifies that within your EMR?
We don't.
Okay.
Sorry, I just had a question. That drug recycling policy sounds really good because I feel like that's a really big frustration for some patients. And, you know, as we know, drug costs are pretty crazy. Are there any like FDA or safety regulations about recycling meds, or is there a process that they require if you were to do that?
Josh, maybe you can comment on this.
Yes, I can. So we instituted a drug repository program in the state of Ohio a few years ago, and I was fortunate enough at the time to be on the board of pharmacy. So had a little bit of inside information there and some inside ability to manipulate that legislation. So we were the first entity in the state of Ohio to open a drug repository program. There are no FDA restrictions on it. This is all a state law issue. In our state of Ohio, we can accept any drug from we can accept any oral oncolytic or any oncology supportive care drug from a patient, regardless of whether the package is open or closed. We just have to go through sort of a checklist of, the pharmacy has to go through a checklist of things to ensure that that product is of high quality. And then there's just a very, very simple amount of paperwork that you have to do for the person donating and then for the person receiving. I can tell you, in our practice, we're in our third year, I believe, of our drug repository program, and we're approaching $500,000. When you look at just the acquisition cost of the drug, this year we'll top $500,000 in free drug for our patients. It's been an enormous success. Great. And in fact, since our implementation 3 years ago, I've been contacted from hospitals and other pharmacies around the state to try to help them set up their program too. So I would encourage all of you to approach your state legislator and see if there is legislation on the books. A lot of times there already is, and the state boards of pharmacy haven't implemented it. And if there isn't, work with them to try to get one set up.
Great point, Josh. I think the only exception would be the drugs under the REMS program, like Revlimid. They won't allow patients to donate that, but pretty much everything else.
Yep.
Great question from you, Azan. Next slide. All right, Josh, right to you.
All right.
Thanks, Annette. That was great.
Okay, so transitioning a little bit here to a topic maybe that's not quite as sexy, but managed care and payers, things we all love to talk about. So you've all, from the introductions, it seems like everyone's been out of fellowship for 2 or 3 years. So if you've been practicing for more than 10 minutes, you know what a prior authorization is. So I'm not going to go into defining what that is, but rather talk just for a second about the importance of it and what are some of the practical implications of prior authorization and how it can affect sort of the operation in your practice. And then, of course, how it can affect the economics. But as you're all likely aware, virtually every single drug, even if it's not an oncolytic, but even a supportive care medications require prior auth. And because we are in a reimbursement-based model where we're being reimbursed on average, average sales price plus 6%, unless we're under sequestration when it goes down to 4.3%. As was mentioned before, the margins are getting slimmer and slimmer. So it's incredibly important that we have an extremely efficient prior authorization process because, as you can imagine, with the margins the way they are today, failing to get prior authorization just for 1 or 2 patients can eat away the margins that are associated with dozens and dozens of patients. But from a more practical perspective, I think that's something that a lot of times physicians don't think about or might not realize is that, and it's how, what process do you use to order your medications, right? Are you someone who sees your patient same day and then signs those orders and wants them treated the next day? Are we doing a lot of add-on therapies in our clinics that can then put a lot of pressure on the prior authorization team located within your practice and can dramatically increase the risk of failing to get appropriate prior auth, which then will end up either resulting in a denial, but almost inevitably resulting in costing the physician a lot more time in providing more documentation for denials or having to get peer-to-peers or spending time on the phone with payers and that sort of thing. So
Josh,
I'm
going to throw in a question here for
Yep.
both Bimal and Annette, and I'll preface the answer first. So I think some of the best practices that I've found in getting prior authorizations, number one is when you get on the phone, number one, if this has been presented at a tumor board or has been seen by academic center, make sure you tell the reviewer that this has been presented and this is the opinion of several different oncologists, number one. Number two, always mention the buzzword, this is NCCN supported. That's likely to get a prior authorization for you. Number three, if there's a driving need and an emergency to get the treatment in, do mention the word, this is life-threatening, and without this treatment, there's threat to a limb or to the life that will get their feet up. Number four, if there's a least resistance, meaning if you have 2 alternative pathways, acalabrutinib versus ibrutinib, please do not waste your time to get authorization for the other one. You're not going to be successful. You're wasting your time and it doesn't make any sense. Those are the 4 pointers from me from the last 10 years. Bimal, can you throw them some pointers about pre-authorizations and what you do?
So I think your points are well taken and things of that sort work out. So we have at least just in our organization, pre-authorization is obviously done by staff and not necessarily physicians, but it does eventually get to physicians when there is peer-to-peer review required. And I think the points you made, Sujit, are more relevant, of course, when there is a peer-to-peer, when any physician who has to get on a phone to explain to a physician who's usually not an oncologist, but maybe an oncologist, to explain what is it that you're trying to do and why is it that they should authorize it. So we tend to follow, being aware of the guidelines published by payers for a given situation. We tend to negotiate with payers to say, if we are following your guidelines as published by you, which most of the time adhere to NCCN, then we should not really even be required to pre-authorize, if you will. So we work on a lot of different things to try to reduce the burden, administrative burden, delay burden. But you're right that when the payers have an interest in creating these barriers because that I think fatigues and delays and eventually raises the bar for intervention. And so, they tend to be unrelenting, even though it's legitimate. We've looked at some automation, like can you have a robotic call made, and while you're on the wait, your staff is on the wait, you're really doing other work, so that you're not wasting your staff time till the live human being comes on board. So I think there are a lot of tricks to it. It's part of the unfortunate process by which we have to conduct ourselves and in our clinical judgment, as Josh said. And it is very fatiguing, but those are my thoughts.
Back to you, Josh.
Great, thanks. So some of the other trends that we're seeing that are relatively new over the last few years with payers are things like preferred formularies and step edits. So preferred formularies really haven't touched the oncology space that much, so long as we are using, NCCN guidelines sort of based protocols, which I think an overwhelming majority of the time we are. But now we're starting to see, especially with the advent of biosimilars and a lot of Me Too drugs, a lot of opportunities for preferred formularies. And then we're starting to also see some impact of the total cost of care and rebates. And once we start talking in a moment about value-based care, a lot of the payers will start looking at drug costs a little differently than just what the acquisition cost or what their reimbursement rates are. So the impact of these preferred formularies can be significant because with biosimilars, for example, it impacts the number of products. If you live in a region that has a lot of different payers, then you may find yourself, or the pharmacy department may find themselves with large inventories of various biosimilars, which can have a significant impact on the practice's cash flow. So it's important to have an understanding of how we do our formulary management, or how those things can impact the formulary management within our organization. I think most practices today have relatively established formularies, especially around supportive care drugs, which can have a significant impact on your total cost of care and the economic benefits to the practice. And then lastly, contract management. Most larger practices have a team, usually a pharmacy team, that is responsible for looking at and evaluating your contracts for all of your branded products that you're using. And the appropriate management of those contracts can have a significant impact on the practice economics, an impact that is 6 or 7 figures per year in the net cost recovery for a drug. And it's interesting because some of the trends that we see in managed care make it even more difficult for us to do that, because of these preferred formularies that are forcing us into using one drug versus the next. It's difficult for us to have 1 or 2 particular agents on our formulary that allow us to maximize the contract value there. So physicians really have little control over that piece of it, but just having an understanding of how the managed care or how the managed care players can impact the formulary management, ultimately resulting in an impact on our practice cash flow and our ability to manage the contracts that we get from our pharma partners.
Hey, Josh, quick question here, because you're interfacing on a lot of these contracts. You're probably even seeing them before they come out, and you're having the conversation. And you don't have to get to the exact, the drug itself, but what's a good contract versus a bad contract, in your opinion?
Well, it depends what you're talking about, IV versus oral. So I'll talk about IVs, I guess, real quick. There are a lot of different versions of contracts that are decent. The ones that I think bother me the most, but they're also the most common, are the just volume-based contracts or growth-based contracts. We don't always have control over the types of patients that come into our practice, or the volume of triple negative breast cancer that comes into our practice, for example. So we can't always maximize those contracts, and we're left a little powerless there. And then we have market share contracts, which depends on the drug class, right? So sometimes I think market share contracts can be great, and sometimes they are bad. I think that the best types of contracts are just historically based, volume-based contracts, where you have a baseline that's based on your previous 2 quarters of utilization, and they're trying to look for sustainability there as opposed to a significant amount of growth. And then on the oral side, it's a little simpler. The oral side has changed a lot over the last few years because of some of the shenanigans that we see from the pharmacy benefit managers. When someone comes to me with an oral-based contract, they're always structured under WAC, wholesale acquisition cost. And we tell the pharma partners that we have to start at like WAC -8. They used to be at WAC -1, WAC -2. But if we're purchasing a drug at WAC -2, we are losing hundreds of dollars per prescription. So we have to be at a WAC -8 model in order to be above water.
That's great. Thanks, Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. So we're just we always call audibles here. We're trying to balance the information and get the pulse check. We will visit one of these slides, especially Sujit. We'll handle the last one, which is the update on value-based care that you pulled today. We figure for the sake of time and just cohesiveness, Josh, if it's okay, we'll jump into your next section, which is pharmacy services and PBMs.
Sure. Okay, next slide. Okay, so to start off talking a little about medically integrated dispensing, I think this is important because when you start having conversations with payers and looking at payer contracts as a practice leader and talking about some of the value that your practice can bring, I think a lot of times, and of course I'm biased because I'm a token pharmacist on the panel here, but I think a lot of times physicians see their in-house pharmacy, as just sort of a typical pharmacy. They go in there and they dispense the medications, maybe they provide some patient counseling. But in the community oncology space, the story really is a lot different. NCODA recently coined the term medically integrated dispensing or medically integrated pharmacy, and that's really what we are. But what does that mean? If you can imagine, the pharmacy that's located in your practices, if you have one, they obviously have direct sight into the EHR. The benefits of that are enormous. There aren't any other pharmacies around the country that can see that patient's electronic health record, see the progress notes that you just wrote, look at the patient's labs, see their images, and all of the things associated with the patient's care. By doing so, we're able to provide much more comprehensive pharmacy services to that patient. We're able to reduce costs significantly. And just to give you an example of how we can do that, if a patient is on a maintenance medication they've been on for a while, and we see a note, we're getting ready to provide the patient with their next cycle, but we see a note from yesterday that the physician wrote that the patient's progressing. CVS Caremark or one of these big pharmacies will go ahead and dispense, 30, 60, 90 days worth of that $13,000 medication. Whereas we are looking at your notes and the patient's EHR, or we're looking to see that the patient's serum creat just jumped and they're going to need a dosage reduction or a change in therapy, and we're not dispensing those medications. So we're saving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year in cost avoidance there. Huge benefits to the patient, the practice, and the payer. We have the ability to, of course, the physicians are right down the hallway from us. So we are able to help coordinate care. We're able to help get prior authorizations and financial assistance much better. When patients go to outside pharmacies, the financial assistance is almost absent. So having a medically integrated pharmacy is something that I think that all the physicians in the practice need to understand exactly what those benefits are, because your ability to negotiate better contracts with payers and keep the longitudinal care of your patient inside your practice will be significantly enhanced. Next slide. So we mentioned pharmacy benefit managers, and I don't know what the group's knowledge is. And this is one of those topics that we could talk about for a long, long time. And I promise I won't, Joel. Do cringe.
I'm going to buy you a drink for doing this.
Right. So having a top-line understanding of what PBMs do and how they function is extremely important. It's also extremely complicated. It took me years to develop a reasonable understanding of our drug channel and how pharmacy benefit managers fit into it. A lot of times people think PBMs, well, let me define them first. PBMs are companies that payers hire to manage the pharmacy benefit of a particular plan. A lot of times people think that it's just on the oral side, but that is not true. The PBMs are hired by the large payers to manage both the oral and the IV side of their formularies. So we are starting to now see PBMs creep into the IV side, start making recommendations about, which PDL or which PD-1 inhibitor do we want on formulary, which one's most cost effective. So don't be surprised when we start seeing recommendations about those sorts of things for major payer formularies. PBMs have become a problem because of the 4 bullet points I have listed there, mainly the top 2. So the 3 biggest PBMs are owned by the 3 biggest payers. So we have a lot of vertical integration going on there. And those 3 PBMs also own the 3 biggest specialty pharmacies. So they are very much incentivized to take over the care of your patients, especially in oral oncolytic and other specialty settings.
So Josh, which are the 3, and can you just name them, the 3 and 3?
Sure. So the 3 PBMs are Optum, and they have a Briova is their specialty pharmacy. It's CVS Health, which owns the PBM CVS Caremark, which owns CVS Specialty. And then you have Express Scripts as the PBM, which owns a Credo specialty pharmacy. Those 3 PBMs together cover 80% of the lives in the pharmacy benefit world, 80%.
I think hearing those names will make them understand hopefully a little better of who they're dealing with.
Sure. And it's very confusing to patients when the medical oncologist writes a prescription for a complicated therapy that's very expensive, and maybe they go to the pharmacy that's in the practice. That pharmacy could probably dispense that drug same day or next day, and yet they have to wait 2 weeks or sometimes 3 weeks to get their medication from a Credo or CVS Caremark. All the while their radiation therapy or their concomitant IV therapy is being delayed because the PBM can't turn the authorization around in time, or the PBM is simply so big that they don't even know that they've received a prescription for that patient. So it can be a real big mess.
So Josh, can you just comment on, in your practice, in your pharmacy, for an oral medication, what percentage of the time for the first fill you're able to fill in your pharmacy? And of the percentage of patients that you fill in your first fill, when it comes to the second fill on the prescription, how many do you lose out to outside pharmacies through the PBMs, and how many you're able to retain across the years?
Sure. So it's important to understand what our payer landscape looks like when we talk about script capture. Our payer landscape, we're about 50% Medicare, and then we've got, the rest of our population is 3 or 4 big commercial payers. So a vast majority of practices that are in that situation are going to lose almost all those commercial payers. And the first fill situation is something that still exists from time to time, but it's not that much. So we're capturing about, we get all of the scripts are sent to us. Every single prescription that the medical oncologist for our practice writes comes to us first. So we keep and retain about 60% of those prescriptions at this point. We do have some first fill, but of that 60%, I would say we are doing long-term fills for probably 95% of that 60%.
So you retain about 55% of all patients.
Yes.
What about you, Bimal, in California with the managed care and such? What's your capture rate, and how much do you lose out?
We have been, unfortunately, not able to capture as much as we would like, just because of the same sort of pressures everybody's feeling nationally. I would say that of all the oral prescriptions we write, and let's say that's our true denominator of X, we just can't even fill probably 0.4X. And then off the 0.6X, we feel we are garbled in our operations that we fill only half of that, so 0.3 or 0.35X, because patients are demanding to get things done quicker, and they're anxious, and our ops team hasn't gotten to it. So we have a lot of work to do internally, operationally, to even get to the 0.6X before we worry about negotiating with our payers. And there's recently, today, there was something in the news that the Federal Trade Commission is looking at PBMs because of a lot of health plans have gotten into PBMs, and the reason they've gotten into PBMs is because Obamacare or ACA restricts the profitability in the health plan side from the premium and administrative cost to be spending so much for care delivery, and profits are only limited. So they're getting into all sorts of other instruments where such regulation does not apply to try to have their profit centers be moved around, and they think that there is a significant amount of profits in it. So that's what they're trying to do. So I think this pressure is only going to go worse, not less.
And what's your payer mix in San Francisco?
Our payer mix is no different than most of the oncology practices. I would say about 40 to 45% Medicare. We have about 30%, 30% HMOs or managed care, and about 30% or 35% PPO or commercial product, and 5-10%. In some markets we have a little higher, but the average practice-wide is probably 10% safety net or Medicaid or Medi-Cal, as they call it in California.
Annette, quickly on your practice, anything similar or?
I would say similar to Josh's practice, so we try to make sure every prescription goes to our in-house pharmacy. But again, the first fill, maybe 50 to 60%, we are able to do that. The rest is mandated to specialty pharmacy. And then subsequent fills, roughly about 50% we can keep. So we lose a lot to the specialty pharmacies and the PBMs.
Thanks, Josh. Back to you.
So just in closing on this topic, the pipeline for oral oncolytics is rapidly growing. It has rapidly grown over the last 5 to 10 years. And the result of that is not only does it increase the importance of really good education, toxicity assessments, adherence management for your patients, which we'll talk about, but it also has a significant impact on practice economics. I can tell you that for our practice, about 40% of the physician compensation comes from our dispensing program, 40%. So it's enormous. So it is very important that it's very important that we develop an understanding of not only how to make that operation work as efficiently as possible, but also to have an understanding of how these outside players like PBMs influence our practice. Because while we can't get into it tonight, I can tell you that their influence is enormous. And as was mentioned a second ago, for years now, they've been coming under a ton of scrutiny. And I am just kind of sort of cautiously optimistic that because the Federal Trade Commission got involved a few weeks ago and made some announcements, that we might make some progress on sort of reducing the power that the PBMs have over our practices and our patients.
Yeah, Josh, I mean, historically, the PBMs have had the largest revenue pool out of any intermediary on the drug side, orals or IVs. I mean, we're talking about ranges of, 12 to 16%, and that's extremely common across the board.
And lastly, people always ask you as healthcare professionals, why are drugs so expensive? And that's obviously a very complicated answer. But if you want to give a really short top line answer, it's PBMs.
Josh, quickly on
is that the bow?
Josh, quickly on staffing for the pharmacy. How big is your physician practice, and how many pharmacists and pharmacy technicians do you need to employ to run a system which sounds very sophisticated and nifty? How many people do you need?
So we have 18 medical oncologists who are prescribing to us, and we have 9 urologists who are pretty high volume prescribers. But to give you a better,
how do you get urologists to toe the line?
Pardon me?
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
To give you a better idea, we fill about 1,400 prescriptions a month. And we do all of our own financial counseling. We do all of our own prior authorization. We do all of our own everything is centralized to our pharmacy because we found that it was more efficient than using other team members and making 27 phone calls. And so we do all of it ourselves. I have 4 pharmacy technicians and 1.25 pharmacists.
Okay, thank you.
And so if you think about a revenue center, you have basically 6 FTEs of people that are doing $55 million a year.
That's massive.
That's great. Yeah.
Can we go to the next slide? So we're rounding the bend here, and last but certainly not least, Bimmel, this is one that could be an entire weekend seminar. So this was a tough one to put in Bimmel's lap, but he has such an expertise on the strategy and management of community oncology. So if you can take us through, Bimmel, just the preview, give the highlights. I would love to go ahead and just understand the overall response from the audience specifically to this category.
Thanks, Joel. I have 12 minutes and I'm the last
No,
speaker.
well,
And everybody's tired and dead. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, we just
No.
want to, we know that you got to get that birdie on 17 this afternoon.
Yeah. So I think my mission today is just to give the participants some sense of the importance of these business elements, financial elements of the practice. Nothing that was spoken as of now could happen if you're not financially strong, right? You can't accrue in the clinical trials. You cannot do anything well. So I think it's very important that how do you run your business? And I mean that not how do you run your practice, which is what we all think of at the best when we get into private practice. So, you know, when we all get trained in oncology to be academicians, right? I'm sure you remember your mentors and coach in your fellowship want you to be academicians, but some programs are meant to be more clinical in nature than academic. All of us sort out in our journey what excites us, and then eventually we choose different forms of professional life that require us to acquire certain skills. Private practice is, you know, an independent private practice is like a business. It just happens to be a business of being an oncologist. And if you don't have the needed elements and command over what makes it a successful business, you would not do justice to your mission. You know, if you become an academician, you want to be an endowed chair, you want to win Nobel Prizes. If you want to be in private practice, you want to do well. That's the reason you went to private practice. So you need to make sure that you're running a good business to be able to do so. So my job is to give you some drivers that help that make it come about. So I'm going to not speak from my slides, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, Joel, because I do want to be sensitive to time, but I would be happy to take in my coming sessions, based on the feedback from participants, any one topic or multiple topics they're interested in great details, and have sessions dedicated to that. Next. So I think how do you organize as a practice is important. I mean, we all have legal structures of organization of the practice. You know, if you're a single physician, nobody seems to be these days able to be a single physician, but that used to be sole proprietorship. You can have an LLC, you can have an LLP. Most of the practices are structured legally as professional corporation, S or C. There are consequences you need to understand what that means, or true partnerships. How's your structure, not just legally, but from functional point of view, organized? Do you have a board? You know, do you have a physician leader? How is your non-physician leadership structure created, and how is your physician leadership structure created, and how do those two structures mangle or work with each other, and what are the things that work and what are the things that don't work? And how do you take that structure to eventually functional outcomes where you are able to manage the journey of a practice? You know, practice is successful, and I don't speak from having being cocky to say that we have an extremely successful practice. All leaders, Sujit and Nat, can comment. It's a work in progress. We are all striving to become ultimately perfect, and every time we try to every time we feel that we made progress, so something else gives out, because it's a big machine. So operations and finance are two elements that translate into a successful practice. If you create a work environment where your staff, your patients, your physicians are able to get up in the morning and go excited to be at work, and things happen that you were trained to make them happen in time-sensitive fashion, that's fantastic. That's a critical goal, and we call it experiential excellence, meaning, you know, you feel and experience excellence, whether you're a patient, you're a staff member, you're a doctor, you're a referring physician. And financial excellence, which is when you are able to really feel that you're financially strong. Next. So how do you secure these things? Obviously whatever you do has to be measurable, achievable, objective, data-based, metric-based, actionable. This is not something that you just feel. It's more than just a feel. It's not just art. There's something to it more, and you need to learn how to do these things. None of us took classes in economics and finance, and that was not part of the pre-med requirements when we went to med school. So this is all foreign to us, but it's important. Next. How do you really compete? Private practice is about competition in a way, because you're competing with, as Sujit said, health systems, and you will find yourself having to need to compete with people that are really endowed by resources that are lopsided to what you may have. And how do you go about managing that? What is your position? How does it? How did it happen? How does your group standing? Reputation, history. All of these things are important. Next. So I think the strategy and how does one go about organizing the practice is important. Practice finances are relatively simple for people who are finance and in the field and understand it. I think physicians tend to not be very oriented to these things, at least in academic sense, because it's not looked favorably as a physician if you talk about money. You're supposed to serve people, and hopefully money would follow. You're trained in medical school, residencies, and fellowship without a single conveyance of, what do you do clinically? How does it get converted into money? And how do you spend that money to run a business so that you can make a living? I think there's just no exposure to it. So how does one go about formulating a basic? You don't need to be an MBA. You don't need to really be a master or a wizard in finances. You need to just understand and have orientation to it, so you can have your management team do things for you, and then you can relate to it. Next. So what are the surrogates of financial health? Your ability to recruit talent, I think, is the biggest surrogate of financial health. If you can't find good staff members, if you can't find good doctors to join your practice, you're in trouble. Financially. Usually, there are some areas that are hard to compete because of cost of living, like California, and you can be financially strong and still have recruitment trouble. But those are rare scenarios. Usually you should be able to, and unfortunately, the most expensive areas are not necessarily where you do the best financially also. So that makes the recruitment that much more difficult. You have to be able to pay your staff competitively so you can get talented people. Obviously, people are mission-driven, vision-driven, purpose-driven, but if you're not competitive to what the market norm is, then you're not going to get the talent. Talent is critical to be successful. There's an enormous amount of literature about recruitment, retention, turnover, and how corrosive it is, not only just to the culture, but to the pocketbook. How much of silent cost a practice incurs when somebody leaves, when you have to recruit, the cost of recruitment, the cost of training and mentoring before they become productive. And then if they don't last with you for a period of time and depart, then how bad of a financial impact that has, which is silent, doesn't show up on a profit and loss report, but it absolutely has a massive impact. You need to be able to make sure that you are, meeting your metrics, so you're competitive. And you're competitive not just in your gut and your mind, but when you network with your buddies, like I talk to people in Ironwood, you're doing better. Now, by Ironwood standards, we have never done well, but I think that goes with the territory and being in the Bay Area and, so to speak, being in desert. But the point is that I think you need to be aware of what's going on, and you need to be connected with your peers, and you need to talk about these sorts of things. You need to run an organization that is not leveraged. Whenever you want to expand, whenever you put new assets, if you can do it from retained earnings and capital that you have, that is as strong of a financial health surrogate as there could any be. Next.
And Bimal, just real quick, back to the compensation. There's compensation, and then there's incentive structure.
Right.
What incentives do you think work well for
So I think,
clinicians?
it's in a group practice, it's never going to be a pure linear financial incentives, eat what you kill, if you will. The reason is that creates a solo mindset, and a group is a team sport. So you have to have the give and take. But if you become, all of us are same, and doctors tend to believe that and feel that way. And it works in single specialty. In multi-specialty, that's not even possible. But in single specialty, one could claim that all of us are same, and we are going to hence distribute our take home equally. It doesn't work in my mind. We are a capitalistic society. If you don't incentivize people to work hard to generate more in revenue, then you're not going to, your rainmakers will run away if you create an equitability system of that sort. So you really have to have a balancing act. And that, Joel, is honestly very individual. Every group has its own fingers on the pulse of the culture of the group, and that's what decides it. There is no one formula that fits it. Physician compensation is the most controversial thing you can have. It never sits well with everybody. It never is perfect for everybody. It wants to change every 2 years. It's just a work that leaders have to be facile with, to be able to manage, to keep not only the group together, but to keep those incentives alive.
Thank you.
So what are the tools by which you measure the fiscal health? Of course, you have the standard, finance and accounting and economic tools that are relevant to all spaces, not just private practice. You have monthly financial reports, what we call the profit and loss report, cash flow reports, balance sheets. You have analytic reports, which could be based on your practice by site, service line, individual physicians. You'll have cash forecasting reports. You'll have budgeting and capital expense planning, which doesn't happen all the time, but you need to do all of that. You have to have tax planning with your accountants and CPAs. You have performance, especially in RCM, which is revenue cycle management, or billing and collection, as they say, but essentially converting your services, clinical services, into cash. How does that happen? And how do you do that well? So I think these are very important things that we don't go to school to learn, but if we don't do this well, we can be fantastic oncologists, but not do as well as we should, and not be able to invest in our future. And if you think about it, it's not your mission to serve patients well with cutting edge care and providing them a journey that is safe and quality, meet diversity needs of your community. All is dependent on how strong you are financially. There's just no way to do all of that stuff if you're weak financially. You just become inward looking. You would do bad things or wrong things. You would cut corners. You would start to have a downward spiral. So fiscal strength is not just driving the last dollar because you want to pocket it. That's not what it is. It is extremely important to do it because it just allows you to have the means to be able to secure your mission.
Would you ever recommend bringing in a third party, not every year, but every so often, to evaluate the business and the health of the financial balance sheet?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how much of competency you have between physician leadership and management that you would or would not, but you're only as good as till you get yourself checked out by somebody who has seen a bigger part of the world, right? Who's a consultant who has hundreds of clients or life experiences to be able to come and kind of impart best practices. And so it especially if you're not doing well, you absolutely have to have it. And even when you're doing well, it's amazing how redundant, or I should say, complacent people become because they're doing reasonably well and they think that's good enough and they could be doing better. And it's not like they need to make more money because they're going to be more fulfilled. But I think the important is there's a certain pride in running a good show. So I think it's important to have those sorts of things in. Next. So how do you, you need some basic knowledge to be able to exert these insights. What is accounting? What is finance? How is finance and accounting different? What is accounting methodologies? What are the cost structures? What is a fixed and variable cost structure? How do you analyze margin? How do you understand which revenue has what sort of an associated cost? So clearly, if you chase a revenue, that is a very small cost structure or small margin that with minor mismanagement can easily go into the negative territory, that's not the kind of top line growth you want, right? If you sell a car at loss and you have a sale and you sell millions of cars, you may feel good that you sold millions of cars. You just have millions of dollars, million time the negative as a loss now to show, a larger loss. So you have to be absolutely careful in what and how these things come about. And you have to also think of your legal structure, which has some tax planning consequences, and what are the solutions and the knobs you use as an organization with your management competencies, and how do you really translate volume, the work that you can relate to as physicians more than dollars, and map that so you know that, hey, in my space, this kind of a breast cancer patient, not to say that we are going and choosing breast cancer patients as the only patients we would take care of, but there are certain patients by the fact of what you can do and what their natural clinical history is and what interventions you offer have a fundamentally different financial impact. So your practice, your referral patterns, your demographics of payer class all has a massive impact, and your ability to know that and to work that as much as you can in your marketing or in your relationship efforts or referral efforts is extremely important. Next. I think is that the last one, or? Okay. So what are the other things you can do? You need to make sure that how your payer contracts are, how are your vendors? Are you procuring things at the lowest cost point? Are you really staffing your organization from space and human capital in a proportionate metric volume-based way? How many of you are aware of what your nurses are supposed to do in infusion center? And based on the kind of infusions or number of infusions, how many nurses should be there? What sort of metrics do you have? It'll be a great thing to understand. It's very complex. When you go and talk to your nurse, they will think that you've gone crazy, because they think of, just like us, every patient is a unique and an individual patient. It has a unique and an individual need that you cannot really crystallize into anything. If you talk to a nurse about saying that I need to really have metric-based staffing in my infusion center, they'll tell you that, hey, we're not in the business of making widgets. We are in the business of taking care of patients. But that doesn't mean you can't really have a logical approach, because you need some metrics. If you're a growing practice, shrinking practice, how would you make your staff go up or down? Do you just listen to somebody saying that we needed to add a staff member and that's it? Or is there something more that guides you? So these are all very important decisions that translate into fiscal health, fiscal weakness. What is your overhead structure when you compare and contrast to your peers? Overheads are not going to be same. Like our overheads are fundamentally different than Ironwood's overheads because the cost structure is different. But that doesn't mean that you can't still learn from how to manage practice and how to really manage overheads and how to really go about running a lean show. So all of these things are important and will be part of the future topics, and I can happily take any or all of these issues in coming sessions to a deeper level. I think that's it for me.
Yeah, I think, Bimal, you just handled 4 MBA classes in 20 minutes as an overview. But so of the 4 co-chairs, obviously, Bimal, I know your position on it is, based off of tonight and the elements you've gone through or we represented, are you dealing with all of those things as a practice leader? I know the answer is yes, right? You are closely connected. So it just, the magnitude of what we went through and the speed we went through it, this is the world of being a leader in the community oncology, and obviously gaining a level of, you're not going to get it overnight, but gaining a level of depth in all these elements allows you to create that value back to your practice. Is that appropriately said?
Yeah, I think it also depends on who do you have, what kind of team you build. As a physician leader, you need to know your own operating style, right? And each one of us is different. Some of us are great leaders by collecting teams underneath us that are extremely competent, that then goes about doing things, and you are a great delegator, inspirer, but you're not necessarily hands-on kind of a leader. My style has been historically a very hands-on operating style, and that doesn't mean it's a good or a bad or wrong or right style. So based on your own style as leadership, you just have to be true to that. I mean, if you truly are like me, you're not going to have a very independent-minded, highly competent management team, because they're going to feel like you're constantly micromanaging them. And so you need to build appropriate people who would tolerate you, not to say that you're making their life miserable or anything. But on the other hand, if somebody is a physician leader with a more of a hands-off style, then they would need the leadership insights to recognize that their management team needs to reflect their operating style. So it all depends, Joel, in who you are, how complex the enterprise is, how competitive the landscape is, right? So, we're in California, you have to be extremely lean because our reimbursement is not any higher than the rest of the country by a factor that our cost structure is. And, it's a challenge. Fortunately, we are in a very desirable area, so we're able to recruit people, but it's becoming more and more difficult to do so.
Bill, that was great. Can you go to the next slide, please? Sorry, we're a couple minutes over and we cut some of the elements out. We were sensitive that it is a weeknight, but hopefully this gave you a flavor of this discipline approach, which really is that channel filter, which there's so many elements to supporting a viable and thriving community oncology franchise like these four do within their given practices and geography. The next step is we're going to be sending out, it's coming out actually right after the session, is a post-meeting survey. We would appreciate if you fill out the survey, because that is going to be one of the instruments to define what we do next from a deep dive into these elements that you saw tonight, and being able to take it to a level where you get a foundation of how you can be immersed in that, but how you can apply that to your practice and create more value and really have an eye on where the practice goes in the future and accelerate that conversation, that value that you create. So hopefully this was worthwhile. Like you said, it was our first step into this. Never, seen a program like this to this point. We wanted to take this approach to make sure that we work with you along this journey, both on the immersion side as well as what we do Thursday, and make sure that as we move forward in this longitudinal approach, that we create that level of depth and understanding that's the bedrock of how you embrace it and how you apply it to your practice as well. So without further ado, obviously we have Thursday, which is the personal financial wellness, very similar theme, surveys going out. And in October, we will do, Cofai community oncology 2.0. So you'll get a date to that TBD, but I'll leave it up to the co-chairs if you have any final thoughts. If not, we can put a bow on this thing tonight.
I just want to thank the participants and my fellow co-chairs for, wow, an exciting program. Looking forward to part 2.
Yeah, great job, Annette.
Likewise, thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Great job. And Bimal, great job. Sujith, great job.
Thank you.
So thank you again for being with us tonight. Obviously, provide comments and feedback, and we can move this forward from a customization standpoint. So have a great evening. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye now.